He looked at her scuffed sneakers and laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed through the marble lobby of the Empire State Building. To Preston Burrows, the woman standing before him was nothing more than a clumsy nobody who had just ruined his $4,000 Italian suit. He called her worthless. He told her she didn't belong in his world. He even made sure she lost her job that very afternoon. Preston thought he had crushed an ant. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a dragon, because the woman in the cheap hoodie wasn't broke. She was Madeleine St. Clair, the silent owner of the very company Preston was begging to merge with. And she wasn't just going to fire him. She was going to destroy him. The morning rain in Manhattan didn't wash the city clean. It just made the grime slicker. Maddie Sinclair adjusted the strap of her fraying canvas messenger bag, keeping her head down as she navigated the crush of bodies entering the revolving doors of the grand obsidian glass tower on Fifth Avenue, the Sterling Heights building. She wasn't here to rule the world. Not today, anyway. Today, she was Maddie, a temporary executive assistant filling in for a woman on maternity leave. She wore a beige cardigan she'd bought at a thrift store in Brooklyn for $8 and a pair of black slacks that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy, practical bun, held together by a cheap plastic clip. She checked her watch, a Casio with a scratched face. 8:52 a.m. She was cutting it close. She balanced a cardboard tray of 4 extra hot lattes in one hand and a stack of financial binders in the other. Just as she stepped out of the elevator onto the 40th floor, the executive suite of Burroughs Capital, it happened. A man was backing out of the double-glass doors, barking into his phone, not looking where he was going. He was tall, impeccably groomed, wearing a navy blue suit that screamed Savile Row. "I told you, sell the position. I don't care if the market is crashing. Get me out," he shouted, spinning around sharply. His elbow caught the edge of Maddie's cardboard tray. Physics took over. The lid of a venti Americano popped off. Scalding black coffee launched itself onto the man's chest, soaking into the silk of his tie and the pristine wool of his jacket. The lobby went silent. The receptionists stopped typing. The security guard by the elevator froze. Maddie gasped, dropping the empty cup. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. Let me—" She reached into her bag for a tissue, her heart hammering. The man, Preston Burrows, looked down at his chest. He didn't move. He just stared at the brown stain spreading across his heart like a gunshot wound. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to Maddie. His eyes were a piercing, icy blue, devoid of any warmth. Preston Burrows was the VP of Acquisitions. He was 32, handsome in a predatory way, and widely known in New York finance circles as the butcher for how he dismantled companies. "Don't," he hissed, holding up a hand as she approached with a napkin. "Do not touch me." "It was an accident," Maddie stammered, her voice low. "You turned around so fast I couldn't—" "You couldn't what?" Preston stepped into her personal space, towering over her. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with the sharp scent of spilled coffee. "You couldn't use your eyes? Or is your brain as cheap as those shoes?" Maddie flinched. She looked down at her sneakers. They were worn, yes. Comfortable. She walked everywhere in the city. "I said I'm sorry, sir. I'll pay for the cleaning." Preston let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a dark sound. He looked around the lobby, making sure his staff was watching. He loved an audience. "You'll pay for it?" Preston repeated, his voice booming now. "This is a Tom Ford custom fit. The tie is Hermes. The shirt is Egyptian cotton. This outfit costs more than you make in 6 months. You think you can pay for it? With what? Your tip jar money?" "I'm a temp here, Mr. Burrows. I'm filling in for Sarah," Maddie said, trying to keep her dignity intact. Her chin lifted slightly. And accidents happen. There's no need to be personal. Preston's eyes narrowed. He didn't like that she wasn't crying. He didn't like that she was looking him in the eye. Personal? He sneered, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. You are a liability. You are clutter. People like you. You drift in here with your bad coffee and your sad little lives, clogging up the machinery of actual important people. You are nothing. He turned to the head of security, a burly man named Dave, who looked uncomfortable. Dave, Preston snapped. Escort this trash out of the building. Sir, she's the temp for the merger meeting files, Dave started. I don't care if she's the Queen of England, Preston shouted, his face reddening. She ruined my suit before the biggest meeting of the quarter. Get her out, and call the agency. Tell them if they ever send someone this incompetent again, I will sue them into oblivion. She's fired. Right now. Maddie felt a heat rising in her chest. It wasn't shame. It was something hotter. Something familiar. It was the old rage she had suppressed for 3 years. She gripped the strap of her bag. You're firing me over a coffee stain? I'm firing you because you're broke, clumsy, and ugly to look at, Preston said cruelly, brushing the liquid off his lapel. Now get out of my sight before I have you arrested for assault. Maddie looked at him. Really looked at him. She memorized the curve of his sneer, the arrogance in his posture, the way he dismissed her existence as if she were a gnat. She took a deep breath. She could end him right now. She could pull out her phone, make one call to the board of directors, and have him escorted out in a cardboard box. But that was too easy. That was too quick. Preston Burrows needed to learn a lesson. A slow, painful lesson. Fine, Maddie said softly. She placed the remaining stack of binders on the reception desk. Good luck with the merger, Preston. I hear the St. Clair family is particular. Preston froze for a split second, surprised she knew the name of the investors, but he quickly dismissed it. Go back to the gutter, sweetheart. Leave the business to the adults. He turned his back on her and stormed toward his office, barking at his terrified assistant to get him a spare suit. Maddie turned around and walked to the elevator. She didn't cry. As the doors closed, shutting out the sight of the snickering receptionists, her posture changed. The slump in her shoulders vanished. Her gaze sharpened. She pulled out her cracked iPhone 8. She ignored the cracks and dialed a number, saved simply as The Wolf. It's me, she said, her voice dropping the frantic temp persona, replaced by a tone of absolute command. Prepare the jet, and get me the dossier on Burrows Capital. Specifically, Preston Burrows. Everything. His debts, his secrets, his weaknesses. A pause on the other end. Miss St. Clair, I thought you were on hiatus. You said you wanted a normal life. Maddie watched the floor numbers tick down. 30. 20. 10. The hiatus is over, she said coldly. I found a bug I need to crush. To understand the magnitude of Preston's mistake, you have to understand who Madeleine St. Clair really was. 3 years ago, Madeleine had vanished from the high society tabloids. She was the sole heiress to the St. Clair dynasty, a portfolio of luxury hotels, shipping lines, and most importantly, a massive private equity firm called Aureus Global. The world knew her as the Ice Princess. She had taken over the company at 24, after her father's sudden death in a skiing accident in the Swiss Alps. The media expected her to crash the company. They expected a party girl who would blow the fortune on yachts and bad marriages. Instead, Madeleine had doubled the company's value in 18 months. She was ruthless. She was brilliant. But she was also exhausted. The sycophants, the fake friends, the men who only wanted her for her black card. It had suffocated her. So she did the unthinkable. She appointed a proxy CEO, a trusted family friend named Arthur the Wolf Sterling, no relation to the building, and stepped into the shadows. She wanted to know what it felt like to be normal. She wanted to know if she could survive without the St. Clair name opening every door. She moved to a small apartment in Bushwick. She took temp jobs. She learned to budget for groceries. She went by Maddie Sinclair, and she loved it. Until today. Preston Burrows had shattered the illusion. He had reminded her that without the shield of money, the world could be a cruel, unforgiving place. He hadn't just insulted her. He had insulted every person who worked hard just to survive. Maddie walked out of the building and into the rain. She didn't run to the subway this time. She walked 3 blocks east to a nondescript parking garage on 38th Street. She took the elevator to the basement level, a private floor secured by biometric scanners. She pressed her thumb against the pad. The light turned green. "Welcome, Miss St. Clair." The heavy steel door slid open. Inside, resting under a custom car cover, was a matte black Aston Martin DB11. But she ignored the car. She walked to the back of the garage where a small, secure office was set up. Arthur Sterling was waiting for her. He was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than Preston's car. He stood up immediately as she entered. "Madeline," Arthur said, concern etched on his face. "You're soaking wet." "I'm fine, Arthur," she said, pulling the cheap clip out of her hair and letting her wet, dark locks fall over her shoulders. She stripped off the thrift store cardigan and threw it into the trash bin. "Tell me about the Burrows deal." Arthur tapped his tablet, projecting a hologram of financial data onto the glass table. "Burrows Capital is desperate," Arthur explained. "They leveraged too heavily on commercial real estate in 2023. They are bleeding cash. They need a merger with a liquidity provider to survive the quarter. They approached us, Aureus Global, 2 weeks ago. They think they are negotiating with me." "And who is leading the negotiation for them?" Maddie asked, though she already knew the answer. "Preston Burrows, the CEO's nephew. He's aggressive, unstable, but he brings in high-risk, high-reward deals." Maddie walked over to the minibar and poured herself a glass of sparkling water. "He treated me like garbage today, Arthur. He didn't know who I was. He saw a temp with a coffee stain and treated me like I wasn't human." Arthur sighed. "The arrogance of the mid-level rich. It's always the worst kind. What do you want to do? We can pull the deal. Bankrupt them by Monday." Maddie took a sip of water, her eyes dark. "No, that's too fast. If we pull the deal, they'll just find another investor. Maybe JP Morgan, maybe the Saudis. No." She turned to face Arthur, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "We proceed with the merger meeting," she said. "Okay." Arthur nodded slowly. "The final signing is scheduled for this Friday. A gala at the Plaza Hotel. Black tie." "Perfect," Maddie said. "I want you to tell them that the owner of Aureus Global has decided to step in personally to sign the deal. Tell them the silent partner is coming out of retirement." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "You're going to reveal yourself?" "I'm going to walk into that ballroom," Maddie said, pacing the room. "And I'm going to make Preston Burrows watch as I buy his life out from under him. I want to own the building he kicked me out of. I want to own the chair he sits in." "He will recognize you," Arthur warned. "I'm counting on it," Maddie replied. "But by the time he realizes who I am, the ink will be dry on the contract. But I need a makeover, Arthur. Maddie Sinclair is dead. Madeline St. Clair needs to return." "I'll call the team from Paris," Arthur said, already typing on his phone. "And the dress?" "Something red," Maddie said, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. "Like blood in the water." Meanwhile, back at Burroughs Capital, Preston was fuming. He sat in his office, now wearing a spare charcoal suit that he hated because the fit wasn't quite right. He was yelling at his assistant, a terrified young man named Greg. "Why haven't we heard back from Aureus Global?" Preston demanded, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk. "The gala is in 3 days. I need to know if Sterling is bringing the check." "Mr. Sterling's office just called, sir," Greg squeaked. "And?" "They said Mr. Sterling isn't signing the deal." Preston's face went pale. "What? They're pulling out." "No, sir." "No," Greg hurried to correct himself. "They said Mr. Sterling isn't signing it because the owner is coming to sign it." Preston frowned. "The owner? Aureus is owned by a holding company. It's faceless money." "Apparently not, sir. They said the principal will be at the Plaza Gala to vet you personally. If they like you, the deal goes through. If they don't, they walk." Preston leaned back in his chair, a smug grin slowly returning to his face. He ran a hand through his gelled hair. "They want to vet me personally?" Preston chuckled. "Well, that's perfect. Charm is my specialty. Whoever this old billionaire dinosaur is, I'll have them eating out of my hand by the appetizer course." He walked over to the window, looking down at the rainy streets of New York, thousands of feet below. He thought about the girl he had fired that morning. He had already forgotten her face. She was just debris. "Prepare the contract, Greg," Preston said, straightening his tie. "I'm going to be the king of New York." Little did he know, the Queen was already on her way, and she was bringing the guillotine. The next 48 hours were a study in contrasts. While Preston Burroughs was manic, shouting at tailors and berating his junior analysts to prepare briefing books he wouldn't read, Madeleine St. Clair was practically meditative. She was no longer in Bushwick. She was in the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons, her preferred safe house in the city, when she wasn't being Maddie. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Maddie Sinclair was soft. She apologized too much. She made herself small to avoid conflict. Madeleine St. Clair never apologized unless it was a strategic maneuver. She didn't avoid conflict. She ended it. Arthur had flown in her personal styling team from Milan. 4 people hovered around her, like pit crew mechanics working on a Formula One car. "The skin needs more luminosity," Henry, her makeup artist, fretted, dabbing at her cheekbones. "You looked tired, Cherie. What were you eating in Brooklyn?" "Cardboard." "Mostly ramen and bodega sandwiches," Maddie said dryly, looking at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The shadows under her eyes were already gone. Her skin, usually hidden beneath drugstore foundation, was glowing. "Barbarians," Henry muttered. Across the room, a dress hung on a mannequin. It was a custom Versace, archived 3 years ago, never worn. It was a deep, violent shade of crimson silk, cut to cling to every curve and slit, daringly high up the thigh. It wasn't just a dress, it was a weapon of mass distraction. While they worked on her exterior, Arthur sat nearby, going over the finalized merger contract. "The board of Burroughs Capital is ecstatic," Arthur reported, flipping a page. "They think I'm signing on Friday. They have no idea you're even in the country." "And Preston?" Madeleine asked, her eyes closed as her hair was brushed into sleek, glossy waves. "He's vibrating with nervous energy. I have sources inside his office. Apparently he's already mentally spent his performance bonus on a new penthouse in Tribeca. He's convinced the principal is some geriatric billionaire he can bamboozle with scotch and cigar talk." Madeleine's lips curved into a faint smile. "He's going to be very disappointed when I don't ask for a cigar." She opened her eyes. The reflection staring back at her was a stranger to the woman who had carried coffee trays 2 days ago. This woman was terrifyingly beautiful and radiated cold power. "Arthur," she said, her voice crisper now. "Did you add the clause I asked for?" Arthur hesitated. "I did. Section 14b, the Ethics and Conduct Compliance Clause. It gives Aureus global unilateral power to terminate any executive of the merged entity immediately, without severance, upon proof of gross unprofessionalism, harassment, or conduct unbecoming of leadership." "Excellent." "Madeline," Arthur said gently, taking off his reading glasses. "Are you sure about this? This is personal vendetta mixed with business. You used to hate that." "I didn't seek this out, Arthur," she said, standing up. The silk robe she wore rustled. "He brought it to me. He looked at someone he thought had no power and tried to crush them for sport. Men like Preston don't stop until someone bigger than them makes them stop. I am that bigger thing." 5 miles south, in his corner office, Preston Burrows was looking at his own reflection in the window, adjusting the cuffs of a brand-new $5,000 Tom Ford suit. "Greg!" he shouted. His assistant scrambled in, looking exhausted. "Yes, Mr. Burrows. The car service for tomorrow night. Did you upgrade it to the Rolls-Royce Phantom? We need to impress the old man." "Yes, sir. Confirmed." "Good. And tell the events coordinator at the plaza that I want the lighting low during dinner. It makes people more pliable. And make sure the scotch is the 30-year-old Macallan. None of that 12-year swill." Preston was running on adrenaline and caffeine. He was deep in debt, gambling debts he'd hidden from his uncle, leveraged bets on tech stocks that had tanked. If this merger failed, he wasn't just fired, he was ruined. He might even face fraud charges for some creative accounting he'd done to cover his losses. But it wouldn't fail. He was Preston Burrows. He always won. His phone buzzed. It was his uncle, Robert Burrows, the current CEO, calling from his vacation home in Aspen. "Preston," Robert's voice was gravelly. "Don't screw this up tomorrow. Sterling is tough, but whoever this principal is, they are the real target. You treat them like they are the second coming of Christ, do you understand? One wrong move, and they walk away with our liquidity." "Relax, Bobby," Preston laughed, checking his teeth in the reflection. "I've got this handled. By midnight tomorrow we'll be billionaires again. Just have the champagne on ice." He hung up, his confidence a brittle shell hiding the panic beneath. He needed a win. He needed to dominate the room. He thought back to the temp he fired. What was her name? Molly? Mandy? It didn't matter. It felt good to fire her. It reminded him that he had power, that he was above the common rabble. He needed that feeling again tomorrow night. He was going to walk into the plaza, charm the pants off some ancient billionaire, and secure his future. Nothing was going to stop him. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a symphony of old New York money. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars dripped light onto the parquet floors. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements, thousands of white orchids imported from Thailand, and the subtle, metallic scent of immense wealth. A 12-piece orchestra played soft jazz in the corner, largely ignored by the crowd of 300 Manhattan elite. These were the people who owned the city, real estate moguls, tech titans, old money socialites whose grandmothers had hung out with Vanderbilts. Preston Burrows worked the room like a politician running for his life. He looked immaculate in his tuxedo, a flute of champagne effortlessly balanced in one hand. He clapped shoulders, laughed too loudly at jokes made by senior partners, and flashed his predatory smile at the wives of potential investors. But beneath the veneer, he was sweating. His eyes constantly darted toward the massive gilded doors at the entrance of the ballroom. His uncle, Robert Burrows, stood by the bar, nursing a scotch. Robert looked worried. He knew the company's books were worse than they let on. "Where are they, Preston?" Robert hissed when his nephew came by for a refill. "It's 8:15. The signing is scheduled for 9 war." "Sterling said they were en route," Preston said, keeping his voice low. "Relax, Bobby. These billionaire types love to make an entrance. It's a power move. Makes us sweat." "It's working," Robert grumbled. At 8:25 p.m., the large doors opened and Arthur Sterling entered. The room quieted slightly. Arthur was a legend in his own right, the wolf who managed the St. Clair fortune. He was impeccable, silver-haired, wearing a tuxedo that made Preston's look off the rack. Preston immediately disengaged from a boring conversation with a hedge fund manager and strode toward Arthur, his hand extended, his smile dialed up to maximum wattage. "Arthur, good to see you," Preston beamed, gripping Sterling's hand firmly. "Fashionably late, I see. Where is the guest of honor? We have the Macallan 30 ready." Arthur Sterling looked at Preston with an unreadable expression. His handshake was firm but brief. He didn't smile back. "Mr. Burrows," Arthur said coolly. His voice was quiet, yet it seemed to cut through the chatter of the room. "The principal is just arriving. Their car was delayed by paparazzi. You know how the press gets when a St. Clair comes out of hiding." Preston felt a jolt of excitement. A St. Clair? He thought the family had died out or gone reclusive after the old man died in the Alps. If the principal was a St. Clair, the money behind this deal was even bigger than he imagined. Of course, Preston laughed. "Well, bring him in. I can't wait to meet him." Arthur raised one eyebrow slightly. "Her?" Preston blinked. "Her? The principal is a woman, Mr. Burrows, and I suggest you prepare yourself. She is not easily impressed." Before Preston could process this, Arthur turned and walked toward the small raised platform at the front of the room where a podium and a signing table were set up. The contract sat there in a leather folder, waiting. Preston hurried back to his uncle. "It's a woman," he whispered frantically. "A St. Clair woman." Robert frowned. "I thought the daughter disappeared years ago. Some hippie nonsense." "Well, she's back, and she's got the checkbook." Preston straightened his bow tie. A woman. This was even better. He was excellent with women. He could turn on the charm, play the rogue, make her feel like the only person in the room. Old men wanted respect. Women wanted to be seduced by success. He could do that. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. The orchestra stopped playing mid-song. A hush fell over the crowd. It was the universal signal that the money had arrived. Preston positioned himself near the center of the room, perfectly placed to greet whoever walked through those doors. He threw his shoulders back, adopted his most confident stance, and prepared the perfect opening line. The gilded double doors swung open slowly. For a moment, nobody stepped through. There was just the empty frame, heightening the anticipation. Preston held his breath. This was it. The moment his life was saved. Then, a single figure stepped into the light. The silence in the ballroom became absolute. It wasn't a polite silence. It was a stunned, visceral inhalation of 300 people collectively losing their breath. The woman framed in the doorway was a vision of terrifying perfection. She wore red. Not a polite burgundy or a soft rose, but a violent, screaming crimson that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. The silk dress was a feat of engineering, structured yet fluid, clinging to a body that belonged on a Milan runway. A slit rode high up her left leg, revealing a flash of a stiletto heel sharp enough to draw blood. Her dark hair, which Preston had last seen, held up by a cheap plastic clip, cascaded in glossy, expensive waves over one shoulder. Her face, no longer hidden by the shadows of fatigue and fluorescent office lighting, was striking. High cheekbones you could cut glass on, full lips painted the same shade as her dress, and eyes, those cold, piercing blue eyes that scanned the room like a predator assessing a herd. She wore no jewelry except for a single, massive diamond choker that glittered at her throat like ice. Preston stared. His brain misfired. He knew that face. Yet, he didn't. It was like looking at a highly stylized, photoshopped billboard of someone you vaguely remembered from high school. He assumed she was a supermodel, perhaps the principal's trophy wife or escort. She began to walk into the room. She didn't walk. She glided. The crowd parted for her instantly, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns splitting like the Red Sea. She looked at no one, acknowledged no one. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, toward the stage where Arthur Sterling was waiting. Preston, realizing he was staring with his mouth slightly open, snapped out of it. He was the host. He had to take control. He stepped into her path, holding up a hand in greeting, flashing his best, most charming smile. "Good evening," Preston said, his voice smooth, blocking her route to the stage. "I'm Preston Burrows. I don't believe we've met, but your entrance was spectacular. Are you here with the St. Clair party?" The woman stopped. She turned her head slowly to look at him. Up close, the recognition hit Preston like a physical blow to the gut. It wasn't a slow dawn. It was a lightning strike. Those eyes. The specific, icy disdain in them. He remembered the lobby, the spilled coffee, the cheap beige cardigan, the way she had looked at him when he called her trash. No. His mind screamed, "It's impossible." The woman in red didn't smile. She looked him up and down, slowly, deliberately, just as he had done to her 2 days prior. Her gaze rested for a moment on the lapel of his tuxedo, right where the coffee stain had been on his suit. "We have met, Preston," she said. Her voice was low, velvety, and utterly devoid of warmth. It wasn't the meek voice of the temp. It was the voice of someone who owned buildings. Preston's smile froze on his face. His blood ran cold. I'm sorry, I don't recall." Arthur Sterling stepped up beside her. He placed a hand respectfully near her elbow, not quite touching her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice boomed through the silent ballroom, "may I present the principal investor of Aureus Global, the head of the St. Clair dynasty, Ms. Madeline St. Clair." A ripple of gasps went through the room. Cameras flashed. Preston felt like the floor was tilting under his feet. The temp, the clumsy, broke temp he had fired and humiliated in front of his staff. She was Madeline St. Clair. She was the billionaire he was begging for money. His Uncle Robert dropped his glass. It shattered loudly on the parquet floor, but nobody looked. Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was drowning on dry land. Madeline took a small step closer to him, invading his personal space, turning the tables completely on their last encounter. The smell of her perfume, something rare, complex, and incredibly expensive, filled his senses, replacing the memory of stale coffee. "You seem surprised, Preston," she said softly, only for him to hear. "Molly?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Maddie?" One corner of her mouth tilted up in a cruel smirk. "You know, you were right about one thing in the lobby the other day," she said, her eyes locking onto his terrified ones. "What?" Preston managed to choke out. "That suit you were wearing," Madeline said, flicking an imaginary piece of lint off his tuxedo shoulder. "It really was nicer than the one you're wearing tonight. A shame about the stain." She stepped around him, as if he were a piece of furniture placed inconveniently in a hallway, and continued toward the stage, leaving Preston Burrows standing alone in the center of the ballroom, watching his entire world beginning to burn down around him. The walk to the stage felt like a funeral march to Preston, though the rest of the room saw it as a coronation. Madeleine St. Clair moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, the crimson silk of her dress rippling like liquid fire. She ascended the 3 steps to the platform, Arthur Sterling flanking her like a silent bodyguard. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone. The feedback whine died down, leaving a silence so heavy it felt pressurized. Preston, shaking himself out of his stupor, scrambled to follow. He had to save this. He had to spin this. He rushed to the side of the stage, his face glistening with sweat. "Miss St. Clair," Preston hissed, trying to keep his voice low enough that the front row couldn't hear. "Listen, about the other morning. It was a stress reaction. The market has been volatile. I didn't know—" Madeleine ignored him completely. She looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was amplified, crisp and commanding. "My family has always believed that business is not just about numbers. It is about character. A balance sheet can tell you if a man is rich, but it cannot tell you if he is worthy." The crowd murmured in agreement. This was standard billionaire philanthropy speak. They ate it up. "Aureus Global looks for partners who understand the value of every asset," Madeleine continued, her eyes finally flicking to Preston, who was hovering near the contract table like a nervous waiter. "And sometimes the most valuable assets are the ones you overlook because they aren't wrapped in expensive packaging." She walked over to the table where the merger contract lay open. A Mont Blanc pen rested on the leather binder. Robert Burrows, the CEO, had materialized on the other side of the stage. He looked like he was about to have a stroke. He bowed slightly to Madeleine. "Miss St. Clair, we are honored, truly. My nephew, he can be enthusiastic, but he is a top earner." "Is he?" Madeleine asked, picking up the pen. She twirled it between her fingers. "I've reviewed your financials, Robert. Your nephew is $4 million in debt personally, and he has leveraged Burrows Capital's future on high-risk derivatives that are currently failing." The room gasped. Preston's eyes bulged. That's private information." "Nothing is private when you beg for my money, Preston," Madeleine said coldly. She looked down at the contract. "I am prepared to save this company. I am prepared to inject $200 million of liquidity into Burrows Capital effectively immediately. This will save 300 jobs. It will save your pensions." Robert let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a week. Thank you, Ms. St. Clair. However," Madeleine raised a finger, "I have a condition. Clause 14b. She looked at Arthur. Arthur stepped forward and projected a document onto the massive screen behind the stage. The text of Clause 14b was highlighted in red. "The principal reserves the right to terminate any executive officer immediately for conduct deemed grossly unprofessional or abusive to staff, regardless of tenure." Preston laughed nervously. "Well, that's standard boilerplate stuff. We run a tight ship here. Professionalism is our middle name." Madeleine turned to him. The look on her face was almost pitying. "Preston," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate and deadly. 2 days ago, in the lobby of your building, you told a woman she was clutter. You told her she was nothing. You fired her because she spilled coffee on a suit that you didn't even pay for. You charged that suit to the company account, didn't you?" Preston froze. "You called her broke," Madeleine continued, stepping closer to him. The microphone picked up every syllable. "You mocked her shoes. You mocked her existence. You told her to go back to the gutter." She gestured to her dress. "Does this look like the gutter to you, Preston?" Preston shook his head, mute. "That woman was me," Madeline declared, her voice ringing out like a gavel strike. "I wanted to see how you treated the people you thought couldn't help you. And you failed. You failed spectacularly." She leaned over the table and signed the contract with a flourish. "The company is mine," she said, straightening up. "I now own Burroughs Capital." She capped the pen and tossed it onto the table. It rolled off and hit the floor with a click. "And as the owner," she said, turning to face Preston directly, "my first act is to invoke Clause 14B. She pointed at him, a long, elegant finger tipped with a red nail. "You're fired." The silence in the room broke. People started whispering, then talking loudly. It was chaos. Preston stared at her, his face turning a blotchy red. You can't do this. I'm the VP of Acquisitions. My name is on the building." "Not anymore," Madeline said calmly. "Security?" From the side of the stage, Dave, the same security guard from the lobby, stepped forward. He was wearing a new suit, looking sharper than before. He had a grim satisfaction on his face. "Dave?" Preston stammered. "Dave, get back to your post." "I work for Ms. St. Clair now, Mr. Burroughs," Dave said, his voice deep. "She gave me a raise this morning." Dave stepped onto the stage and placed a heavy hand on Preston's shoulder. "Let's go, sir. Don't make a scene." "Uncle Robert!" Preston screamed, turning to his uncle. "Do something! She's crazy!" Robert Burroughs looked at the check for $200 million sitting on the table. He looked at the woman who controlled the future of his family's wealth. Then he looked at his nephew, who was a gambling addict and a liability. Robert turned his back on Preston. "Goodbye, Preston. You should have been nicer to the temp." Preston's scream of rage was cut short as Dave firmly guided him, dragged him, really, off the stage. The crowd parted, not out of respect this time, but out of repulsion. They watched the man who had strutted around moments ago being hauled out, like the trash he had accused Madeline of being. Madeline watched him go. She didn't smile. It wasn't funny. It was justice. She turned back to the microphone. "Now," she said, her voice returning to a professional calm, "let's discuss the future of this company. A future where we treat people with dignity, regardless of the price of their shoes." The applause that followed was deafening. The eviction from the Plaza Hotel was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacle. Preston Burroughs had entered the ballroom 2 hours earlier as a king. He was leaving it as a cautionary tale. Dave, the head of security, didn't roughen him up. That would have been a lawsuit. Instead, he used a firm, humiliating grip on Preston's upper arm, guiding him through the lobby like a truant schoolboy. "Dave, please," Preston whispered, his face burning as they passed the reception desk. "I can fix this. Just let me talk to my uncle privately. Just 5 minutes." "Your uncle left through the side exit, Mr. Burroughs," Dave said, his voice void of sympathy. "He instructed us to retrieve his car immediately. He didn't mention you." The revolving doors spun, spitting Preston out onto Fifth Avenue. The city had turned hostile. The gentle evening drizzle had mutated into a cold, driving rain that slashed sideways, instantly soaking through the thin fabric of Preston's tuxedo. The temperature had dropped, chilling the sweat that had broken out all over his body. "Stay off the property, sir," Dave said, standing like a sentinel at the door. "If you try to re-enter, the NYPD will be called for trespassing." "My coat!" Preston shouted, the wind whipping his hair into his eyes. "My wallet is in my coat at the check-in." "We'll mail it to your address on file," Dave replied, then turned his back and walked inside, the golden glow of the hotel lobby feeling 1,000,000 miles away. Preston stood on the sidewalk, shivering. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out his phone. It was vibrating incessantly. He looked at the screen. It wasn't his friends. It wasn't his dates. Notification. Bank of America. Margin call alert. Immediate liquidation required. Notification. Bloomberg News. Burroughs Capital acquired by St. Clair Dynasty. Executive shakeup imminent. Text from Bookie. Sal. Saw the news, Preston. We need to talk about the 80K tonight. Preston's stomach dropped. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the confrontation on stage vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening dread. He wasn't just fired, he was exposed. The illusion of wealth he had carefully curated, the leased cars, the credit card suits, the leveraged bets, had all relied on his paycheck and his family name. Both were gone in the span of 10 minutes. He looked around. The gala guests were starting to filter out, waiting for their limousines and town cars under the dry safety of the awning. Preston saw Julian, a hedge fund manager he had parted with in the Hamptons last summer. Julian was standing 10 feet away, checking his watch. Julian. Preston stepped forward, forcing a desperate smile. Julian, buddy. Crazy night, right? Listen, could I catch a ride uptown with you? My driver is confused. Julian looked up. He saw Preston's wet hair, the water darkening the shoulders of his tuxedo, the desperation in his eyes. Julian didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He simply looked through Preston as if he were a pane of glass, then turned his shoulder and stepped into a waiting Mercedes. The door slammed shut. The car drove away. He was invisible. He was the clutter now. Preston retreated to the curb, sitting down heavily on the wet concrete. The dampness seeped into his trousers immediately. He put his head in his hands. The city noises, the honking taxis, the sirens, the chatter, blended into a roar of judgment. He thought about the coffee. That stupid, scalding cup of coffee. If he had just accepted the apology. If he had just handed the girl a napkin instead of an insult. If he had just been human. A low purr broke through the noise of the traffic. It was a sound distinct from the rattling taxis, a deep, throaty rumble of a twin-turbo V12 engine. A car pulled up to the curb, right in front of where Preston was sitting. It was an Aston Martin DB11, painted a matte black that seemed to absorb the streetlights. It was a shark of a car, sleek, predatory, and impossibly expensive. The passenger window hummed down. Preston looked up, shielding his eyes from the rain. He expected another mocker, another former colleague coming to take a picture of the fallen prince. Instead, he saw Madeleine St. Clair. She had shed the red gala gown. She was now wearing a sharp, tailored black blazer over a white silk blouse. Her hair was still perfect, her makeup flawless. She looked dry, warm, and powerful. She looked like the owner of the world. She didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with a calm, clinical curiosity, like a scientist examining a bug under a microscope. "Get in," she said. Preston blinked. "What?" "Get in the car, Preston. You're ruining the view for the hotel guests." Preston didn't hesitate. He scrambled up, opening the door and practically falling into the passenger seat. The interior smelled of rich leather and that same expensive, complex perfume she had worn on stage. The heater was on, wrapping him in a cocoon of warmth that made him want to weep. "Thank you," Preston breathed, wiping water from his face. "Maddie. Miss St. Clair. Thank you. I knew you were reasonable. I knew we could work this out." He turned to look at her, his survival instinct kicking back into gear. His brain started whirring, looking for an angle. "Look," he said, talking fast. "You made your point. You humiliated me. Fine. Touché. But you can't really fire me. I know where the bodies are buried at Burroughs Capital. I know the accounts. I know the clients. You need me for the transition. I can consult. I'll take a pay cut. Madeline held up a hand. The silence inside the car was absolute. "You still don't get it?" she said softly. She put the car in park, though they hadn't moved an inch. She turned in her seat to face him fully. "You think this is a negotiation, Preston? You think this is a game where, if you say the right words, you get your tokens back?" I have debts, Madeline." Preston's voice cracked, the bravado crumbling. "Real debts. If I don't pay them, I'm dead, literally." "I know," she said. "I saw your credit report. It's a tragedy of ego." She reached into the back seat. Preston held his breath. Was she going to give him a severance check? A lifeline? She pulled out a brown paper grocery bag. It was wrinkled and stained with grease at the bottom. She dropped it into his lap. "What is this?" Preston asked, staring at the bag. "Open it." Preston opened the bag. Inside, folded neatly, was the beige cardigan, the cheap thrift store knit cardigan she had worn in the lobby 2 days ago. Sitting on top of it was a crumpled $5 bill and 3 ones. "That cardigan cost $8, Madeline said, her voice distant, as if recalling a fond memory. "I bought it when I first moved to Bushwick. I was terrified. I had left my family fortune behind to see if I could make it on my own, to see if people would like me for me, not for the St. Clair money." She looked at Preston's expensive, ruined tuxedo. "That cardigan is warm, Preston. It's durable. It does its job. But you looked at it, and you saw trash. You saw a target." "I'm sorry," Preston sobbed, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. "I'm so sorry." "You're not sorry you did it," Madeline corrected him gently. "You're sorry you did it to me. If I had been just another temp, just another struggling girl trying to pay rent, you would still be laughing about it. You would have gone home tonight, drunk your scotch, and never thought of her again." She leaned closer, her blue eyes piercing him. "That is why you cannot work for me. Not because you are incompetent, though your risk management is terrible, but because you are small. You think money makes you a giant, but without it, you are just a frightened little boy sitting in the rain." "Please," Preston whispered. "Help me. Just a loan. I'll pay you back." Madeline pointed to the bag in his lap. "There is $8 in there. It's enough for a subway ride to Queens and a hot coffee. It's more than you left me with when you had me escorted out." She unlocked the doors. The sound was a loud clack in the quiet cabin. "The job market is tough, Preston," she said, turning back to the steering wheel and gripping the leather. "I suggest you start looking tomorrow, but maybe skip the finance sector. I hear the coffee shops are hiring. You might learn something about service there." "You're leaving me here?" Preston asked, incredulous. "With nothing?" "I'm leaving you with a fresh start," Madeline said, "and a sweater. It's cold outside." She waited. Preston realized there was no second act. There was no reprieve. The Red Queen had swung the sword. Slowly, with trembling hands, he opened the door. The rain roared back in, soaking the leather seat. He stepped out onto the curb, clutching the greasy paper bag to his chest like a lifeline. He slammed the door shut. Madeline didn't look at him again. She shifted the Aston Martin into drive. The engine growled, a deep, menacing sound that vibrated through the pavement and up through the soles of Preston's soaked shoes. The car launched forward, merging seamlessly into the river of yellow taxis and black sedans, its taillights glowing like red eyes in the darkness before disappearing around the corner of 59th Street. Preston Burrows stood alone under the street lamp. The water dripped from his nose. He looked down at the bag. He pulled out the beige cardigan. It was ugly. It was pilled. It smelled faintly of old perfume and dust. He put it on over his soaking wet tuxedo jacket. It was tight, the sleeves too short, the fabric scratching his neck. But she was right about one thing. It was warm. He looked at the $8 in his hand. He looked at the towering skyscrapers around him, buildings filled with money he couldn't touch, people he couldn't know, a world he was no longer part of. He turned and began to walk toward the subway station. He walked with his head down, indistinguishable from the thousands of other tired, broken souls navigating the concrete jungle. For the first time in his life, Preston Burrows was nobody, and he had a long, long way to go to become somebody again. Madeleine drove south on the FDR Drive, the city skyline a glittering wall of light to her right. The adrenaline of the evening was fading, replaced by a quiet, steady calm. Her phone buzzed in the center console. It was Arthur. "Did it go well?" The text read. Madeleine dictated a reply. "It's done. The board is secure. Initiate the restructuring in the morning. And Arthur, order pizza for the late-night staff." "On me." She put the phone down. She exited the highway, navigating the familiar, potholed streets of Bushwick. She parked the multi-million-dollar car in the secure garage and took the elevator up to the street level. She walked a block to her favorite 24-hour bodega. The neon sign buzzed overhead. "Hey, Maddie!" The owner, an older man named Sal, called out from behind the counter. "Long time no see. Where have you been? You look fancy tonight." Madeleine looked down at her suit, then smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Just had a meeting, Sal," she said, leaning on the counter. "It ran late." "The usual?" Sal asked, already reaching for the harsh foil wrapper of a bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich. "Yeah, Sal," Madeleine said, pulling a crumpled $10 bill from her pocket, money she had earned from her last temp paycheck. "The usual, and keep the change." She took the sandwich, the warmth of it seeping through the foil into her hands. She walked out onto the sidewalk, took a bite, and watched the rain wash the city clean. She was Madeleine St. Clair, billionaire heiress. But tonight, she was just Maddie, enjoying a sandwich in the rain, knowing that the world was just a little bit fairer than it had been yesterday. Preston Burrows learned the hard way that true wealth isn't about the suit you wear or the car you drive. It's about how you treat people when you think they have no power. He judged a book by its cover, and that book ended up closing his chapter forever. Madeleine St. Clair proved that dignity is quiet, but karma is loud, it wears red, and it signs the checks. What did you think of Madeleine's revenge? Did Preston deserve to lose everything? Or was it too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. We drop new dramas every week. Thanks for watching, and remember, be kind to everyone you meet. You never know who they might really be.